Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Joseph Campbell, the mythographer who heard humanity singing through its stories. Together and apart, they trace the golden thread of myth through time, one following it inward to the psyche's depths, the other following it outward across the world's cultures. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the eternal stories that shape us. One seeing myth as the language of archetypes rising from humanity's shared unconscious, the other discovering myth as the grand narrative pattern that cultures have woven across millennia to encode transformation itself. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Campbell as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the summer of 1924, Carl Gustav Jung stood in the vast landscape of New Mexico among the Pueblo people at Taos, listening to an elder named Ochriaibiano speak of how the white man seemed mad, always seeking something, his face carved with tension, his heart restless. The elder touched his chest and said that his people thought with their hearts, while the white men thought only with their heads. This moment crystallized something Jung had long suspected, but never felt so viscerally, that Western consciousness had split itself from its mythic foundations, severed the connection between rational mind and the symbolic life that had sustained humanity since it first gathered around fires to tell stories of gods and heroes. Jung had come to this understanding through a labyrinth of his own making. Born in 1875 in the Swiss village of Keswil, he grew up steeped in the cross-currents of his time, scientific materialism pushing forward, religious tradition holding ground, and underneath both, the vast unexplored territory of the human psyche beginning to reveal itself through the pioneering work of the early psychoanalysts. Jung's childhood was haunted by dreams and visions that traditional Christianity could not fully contain or explain. He saw God demolishing his own cathedral in a dream that terrified and exhilarated him. He felt split between two personalities, one a modern Swiss schoolboy, the other something ancient and timeless. These early experiences became the seeds of his later conviction that the psyche contained depths far older than individual biography. After studying medicine and choosing psychiatry as his field, Jung encountered the work of Sigmund Freud and found in psychoanalysis a framework that took the hidden dimensions of mind seriously. But even in their warmest years of collaboration, from 1906 to 1913, Jung felt the constraints of Freud's system. Where Freud reduced symbols to disguised wishes, primarily sexual, Jung intuited that symbols spoke in their own language, pointing toward meanings that transcended personal history. The break with Freud in 1913 plunged Jung into a profound psychological crisis. He later called his confrontation with the unconscious a 6-year journey through visions, active imagination, and encounters with inner figures that would form the experiential basis for his entire theoretical structure. From this crucible emerged Jung's distinctive vision, He proposed that beneath the personal unconscious, shaped by individual experience and repression, lay a deeper stratum he called the collective unconscious. This was not a repository of forgotten personal memories, but rather an inherited foundation of human psychological structure itself. It contained what he termed archetypes, primordial patterns of experience and behavior that predisposed humans to respond to certain situations in universally recognizable ways. The Great Mother, the wise old man, the hero, the shadow, the self, these were not literary inventions, but psychological realities, structures in the psyche as real as the instincts, manifesting through myths, dreams, fantasies, and cultural expressions across all times and places. Jung's investigation of mythology became central to his psychological project because myths, in his view, were the collective dreams of humanity. Just as individual dreams compensated for one-sided conscious attitudes and expressed unconscious contents symbolically, myths performed this function for entire cultures. He traced motifs across civilizations, flood narratives, dying and resurgent gods, dragon battles, sacred marriages, descent to the underworld, and saw in their recurrence not cultural diffusion, but the universal operation of archetypal patterns in the human psyche. When he traveled to Africa, to India, to the American Southwest, he sought not to impose European categories, but to witness how the archetypal dimension manifested in radically different cultural contexts. By the time Jung was developing these ideas in the 1920s and 30s, he had already published extensively on symbolism, particularly in his masterwork, Symbols of Transformation, which had precipitated his break with Freud. He had explored alchemy as a Western parallel to the individuation process, that journey towards psychological wholeness that he saw as the central task of the second half of life. He had articulated the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggested a dimension of reality beyond causality. And he had begun to see his entire psychological project not merely as a medical specialty, but as a response to the spiritual crisis of Western civilization, which had lost its connection to the symbolic and mythic dimensions that gave life depth and meaning. Now, let us turn toward the other figure in our nocturnal conversation, Joseph Campbell, who entered this world on March 26, 1904, in White Plains, New York. Nearly 30 years, Jung's junior, Campbell, grew up in a different context entirely, not the European world of Freud's Vienna or Jung's Zurich, but the bustling 20th century America of rapid change, expanding cities, and increasingly pluralistic culture. Yet from his earliest years, Campbell, too, was captivated by the power of myth, though his entry point was not psychology or medicine, but story itself. At age 7, Campbell's father took him to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and then to the American Museum of Natural History to see exhibits of Native American culture. The boy was transfixed by the masks, the totems, the representations of supernatural beings that seemed alive with meaning. He began reading everything he could find about Native American mythology, accumulating a library of books on the subject even as a child. This early fascination planted a seed that would bloom throughout his life, the conviction that myths were not primitive superstitions to be outgrown, but profound expressions of something essential in human experience. Campbell's education took him through Dartmouth and then Columbia University, where he studied medieval literature and pursued what seemed at first to be a conventional academic path. He earned his master's degree in 1927 with a thesis on Arthurian romance, already drawn to the mythic dimensions of medieval narrative. He traveled to Europe to continue his studies, spending time in Paris and Munich from 1927 to 1929, immersing himself in art, music, and the intellectual ferment of Europe between the wars. It was during these years that Campbell first encountered the work of Carl Jung, whose ideas were gaining prominence in European intellectual circles. The encounter was revelatory. Campbell read Jung's writings on the collective unconscious and archetypes, and suddenly saw a framework that could account for what he had intuited all along, that the recurring patterns in mythology across cultures pointed to something universal in human experience. But Campbell's mind worked differently than Jung's. Where Jung approached myth through the lens of clinical psychology and the individual psyche's structure, Campbell approached it through comparative literature and the grand sweep of cultural narratives. He was captivated not by what happened in the consulting room, but by what happened in the world's great story traditions, from the Babylonian Enuma Elish to the Finnish Kalevala, from Hindu epics to Celtic legends. Returning to America during the Great Depression, Campbell found himself without clear academic prospects. He retreated to a cabin in Woodstock, New York, where for 5 years from 1929 to 1934, he engaged in a rigorous program of self-education, reading 9 hours a day. He worked his way through James, Joyce, Thomas Mann, the major works of world mythology, and, significantly, the complete works of both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung that were available in English. During these years of intense reading and reflection, Campbell began to perceive patterns across mythologies that would eventually crystallize into his most famous contribution, the concept of the monomyth, or hero's journey. Campbell's reading of Jung during this formative period gave him psychological tools to understand why myths had such power over the human imagination. Jung's archetypes provided a theoretical foundation for the recurring characters Campbell found everywhere in myth: the mentor, the threshold guardian, the shapeshifter, the trickster. Jung's concept of individuation, the process by which a person integrates unconscious contents and moves toward psychological wholeness, resonated with Campbell's observation that hero myths consistently involved a journey from innocence through trials to transformation. Yet even as Campbell absorbed Jung's framework, he was creating something distinct, a narrative map rather than a psychological diagnosis, a literary structure rather than a clinical model. By 1934, Campbell secured a teaching position at Sarah Lawrence College, where he would remain for 38 years, becoming one of the most beloved and influential teachers in American education. His courses on mythology were legendary, filled not with dry recitation of names and dates, but with passionate exploration of myth as living wisdom. Campbell presented myths not as historical artifacts, but as ongoing conversations about the deepest questions of human existence. What does it mean to be born, to grow up, to face challenges, to encounter the unknown, to find meaning, to face death? Every culture's myths, he argued, address these universal concerns through the language of symbol and story. During the 1940s, Campbell worked on what would become his first major book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, published in 1949. This work synthesized his decades of reading across world mythologies with Jung's psychological insights and with ideas drawn from other sources. Arnold van Gennep's work on rites of passage, James Fraser's Golden Bough, Heinrich Zimmer's interpretations of Indian mythology. But the synthesis was uniquely Campbell's. He proposed that underneath the vast diversity of hero myths from around the world lay a single pattern, a monomyth that expressed the universal structure of the hero's journey. This journey, as Campbell articulated it, moved through 3 major phases: departure, initiation, and return. The hero begins in the ordinary world, receives a call to adventure that disrupts the everyday, initially refuses the call, but is urged forward by a supernatural aid or mentor, crosses a threshold into a special world of strange powers and events, faces trials and encounters allies and enemies, approaches an inmost cave where the supreme ordeal awaits, achieves the ultimate boon or treasure, and then must return to the ordinary world transformed, bringing back the gift that can renew the community. Campbell saw this pattern recurring with variations in myths from ancient Mesopotamia to modern cinema, from the story of Odysseus to the life of Buddha. The hero with 1,000 faces brought Campbell to prominence and established him as a leading voice in comparative mythology. But it also marked a subtle divergence from Jung that would characterize their relationship throughout. Campbell was reading Jung through the lens of literature and cultural anthropology, not through clinical psychology. He was less interested in the psychotherapeutic implications of archetypal theory than in the storytelling patterns that expressed archetypal themes. Where Jung developed active imagination as a therapeutic technique to engage with unconscious contents, Campbell celebrated the world's myths as humanity's collective active imagination made public. Jung and Campbell never collaborated directly, never sat together for extended conversation, yet they moved in overlapping intellectual circles. They both knew and were influenced by the work of Heinrich Zimmer, the great scholar of Indian art and mythology. After Zimmer's death in 1943, Campbell edited and completed several of Zimmer's manuscripts, immersing himself even more deeply in the Hindu and Buddhist mythologies that Jung had also explored in his psychological writings. Both men were fascinated by the Tibetan Book of the Dead, though again from different angles. Jung wrote a psychological commentary on it, examining its descriptions of after death, states as symbolic representations of psychic dissolution and reintegration, while Campbell explored it as a profound mythic narrative about transformation. By the 1950s, Jung was in his 70s, producing his late masterworks including Mysterium Coniunctionis and Answer to Job, works that push toward increasingly numinous and paradoxical territories, exploring the depths of alchemical symbolism and the theological implications of psychological discoveries. Campbell, now in his 50s, was reaching his stride as a scholar and educator, working on his massive 4-volume study, The Masks of God, published between 1959 and 1968, which traced the evolution of mythology from primitive to modern times across all major cultures. This work showed Campbell's approach at full maturity, sweeping, erudite, synthetic, drawing on archaeology, anthropology, psychology, literature, and religious studies to paint a comprehensive picture of humanity's mythic consciousness. The cultural context of the 1950s and 60s shaped how both men's work was received. Post-war, America was experiencing both material prosperity and spiritual searching. The certainties that had sustained previous generations seemed inadequate to people who had witnessed the Holocaust, Hiroshima, and the existential threat of nuclear annihilation. Into this landscape, Jung's and Campbell's emphasis on myth as living wisdom offered something neither orthodox religion nor scientific materialism could provide: a way to engage with transcendent meaning that was psychologically sophisticated yet experientially grounded, universal yet personally applicable. Jung's work was increasingly translated into English and found enthusiastic audiences, particularly in California, where the newly formed Jung Institutes in Los Angeles and San Francisco trained analysts and hosted lectures. Campbell's work, too, found its moment. The Hero with 1,000 Faces became a foundational text for the emerging field of comparative religion studies and influenced fields far beyond academia, including literature, film, and even business and self-help. Writers and artists discovered in Campbell's monomyth a template for storytelling that seemed to resonate at depths they couldn't quite articulate but certainly felt. Yet we must note an essential difference in how these two men engaged with their public. Jung remained primarily a clinician and theorist, his public presentations and writings always rooted in the authority of psychological observation and therapeutic practice. He spoke from decades of working with patients, analyzing dreams, witnessing psychological transformations. His theories emerged from the consulting room and bore the mark of hard-won clinical insight. Campbell, by contrast, was fundamentally a teacher and storyteller. His authority came not from therapeutic work, but from his encyclopedic knowledge of world mythology and his gift for weaving together disparate traditions into coherent patterns. He made myth accessible, exciting, personally relevant for audiences who might never read Jung's dense theoretical works. When Jung died, on June 6, 1961, Campbell was 57 and at the height of his powers. Jung's death marked the end of an era in depth psychology, though his ideas continued to propagate through the institutes and students he left behind. Campbell would live and work for another 26 years, continuing to teach, write, and lecture, becoming especially known to popular audiences through his television interviews with Bill Moyers, broadcast as The Power of Myth in 1988, shortly after Campbell's death. These interviews, watched by millions, presented Campbell's ideas about myth and meaning in an accessible format that brought his work to a far broader audience than any academic writing could have reached. But let us move beyond biography now and into the deeper territory of ideas, where Jung and Campbell meet as true interlocutors, their different approaches to myth revealing complementary aspects of how story and symbol function in human life. This is where our midnight meditation truly begins, in the space between their two ways of understanding why humans everywhere and always have told stories of heroes, quests, transformations, and returns. At the heart of both Jung's and Campbell's work lies myth, but they approach it from opposite directions, like two travelers meeting at a mountain pass, one having climbed from the north, the other from the south. For Jung, myth arises from within, from the collective unconscious. That layer of the psyche he proposed exists beneath personal memories and repressions. The collective unconscious is not learned or acquired through individual experience, but is inherited, an evolutionary legacy common to all humans. It contains the archetypes, those primordial patterns of experience that structure how we perceive and respond to fundamental human situations: birth, death, mother, father, danger, transformation, wholeness. In Jung's view, when a culture produces a myth, what is really happening is that archetypal contents from the collective unconscious are constellation within the psyche of individuals, shamans, poets, visionaries, and then expressed through the particular cultural symbols and narratives available to them. The specific details vary by culture, but the underlying pattern is universal because the archetype is universal. A Greek myth of Zeus, a Norse myth of Odin, an Egyptian myth of Ra, and a Hindu myth of Indra all express something about the archetype of the powerful masculine divine principle, the sky father, the ordering intelligence. The cultural clothing differs, but underneath is the same psychological reality. Jung understood myths as spontaneous products of the psyche, attempting to process experiences that consciousness cannot fully grasp through rational thought alone. When early humans encountered the overwhelming mystery of existence, the cycle of day and night, the terror of storms, the wonder of birth, the finality of death, their psyches generated mythic narratives that gave these experiences meaning and containment. These myths were not conscious inventions, but welled up from deep psychic layers, shaped by archetypal structures just as dreams are. And because the archetypal structures are universal, myths from different cultures that had no contact with each other nevertheless show striking similarities. This is crucial to understand about Jung's approach. Myths are not primarily about external events or historical memories disguised as fantastical stories. They are symbolic expressions of internal psychic realities. When a myth tells of a hero descending into the underworld, Jung reads this as a symbolic representation of ego consciousness encountering the unconscious depths. When a myth depicts a divine child born in miraculous circumstances, Jung sees the symbol of new consciousness emerging in the psyche. When a myth narrates a battle between order and chaos, Jung recognizes the perpetual tension between conscious structure and unconscious possibility that every psyche must navigate. For Jung, this symbolic reading of myth was not reductive but revelatory. He insisted that symbols, unlike signs, cannot be fully translated into other terms. A sign simply points to something already known. A red light means stop, but a symbol participates in what it represents, carrying meanings that exceed any single interpretation. The cross, the mandala, the dragon, the tree of life, these symbols contain depths that conscious understanding can never exhaust. They connect conscious awareness to the numinous, to the overwhelming sacred dimension that Rudolf Otto called the mysterium tremendum. Myths, built from such symbols, bridge the gap between the ego and the archetypal depths, between temporal existence and eternal patterns. Jung's clinical work constantly reinforced this understanding. He noticed that patients in psychological crisis often spontaneously produced imagery in their dreams and fantasies that paralleled mythological motifs they had never consciously encountered. A modern European patient might dream of quaternities and mandalas similar to Tibetan Buddhist sacred art without any knowledge of Buddhism. Someone in the depths of depression might dream of descents into underworlds that paralleled the stories of Inanna or Persephone. A person undergoing profound psychological transformation might produce imagery of death and rebirth that echoed worldwide initiation myths. For Jung, these parallels were not coincidental, but evidential. They showed archetypes in action, the same deep structures of psyche producing similar symbolic expressions across time and culture. Jung's therapeutic method involved helping patients understand their personal psychological struggles through the lens of universal mythic patterns. If you could recognize that your suffering was not merely a personal failure, but an expression of an archetypal situation that humans had faced since time immemorial, it gained dignity and meaning. Your depression was a descensus ad inferos, a necessary descent that might lead to rebirth. Your conflict was a dragon fight, the ego struggling with regressive unconscious forces. Your sense of being torn between options was a divine marriage problem, the need to unite opposites within the psyche. By reconnecting personal psychology to myth, Jung helped patients see themselves as participants in eternal dramas, which paradoxically made their suffering more bearable and their healing more possible. The process of individuation, which became the central focus of Jung's mature psychology, is fundamentally a mythic journey as he conceived it. Individuation is the gradual unfolding and integration of the self, not the ego, but the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. It involves recognizing and integrating the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we reject and project onto others. It involves encountering the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche that mediate between ego and unconscious. It involves many other encounters with archetypal figures, each representing different aspects of the total personality seeking acknowledgement and integration. This process, Jung observed, follows a pattern remarkably similar to the mythic hero's journey, but with a crucial difference from how Campbell would later articulate it. For Jung, individuation happens primarily in the inner world. It is a psychological process, worked through dreams, active imagination, and symbolic engagement with unconscious contents. The external life might reflect this inner work, but the real journey occurs in the psyche's depths. When Jung analyzed myths, he was interested in their psychological meaning, what they revealed about the soul's structure and development, not primarily about cultural values or social roles. Moreover, Jung emphasized that individuation was not a linear journey with a clear endpoint, but a spiral or circumambulation, a continuous approaching of the self that could never be fully completed. The self, the archetype of wholeness, functions as a guiding principle throughout life, but always exceeds the ego's grasp. It appears in dreams and myths as divine child, wise old man or woman, mandala, or geometrical symbols of totality, but it can never be possessed or fully understood, only approached with awe and humility. Jung was deeply attentive to the compensatory function of myth. Myths arise, he believed, when a culture or individual becomes too one-sided, too imbalanced. The psyche generates compensatory symbols to restore equilibrium. In his late work Answer to Job, Jung controversially suggested that the emergence of Christianity itself could be understood as a compensatory movement in the development of Western religious consciousness, the incarnation of God in human form, the emphasis on suffering love, the inclusion of feminine wisdom in the divine through Mary, all compensating for the excessive patriarchal and judgmental quality of Yahweh. Whether one accepts this particular interpretation or not, it demonstrates Jung's method always looking at myth as expressing psychic needs and movements, the unconscious speaking to consciousness. Now turn your attention to Joseph Campbell's approach, so different yet complementary. Where Jung descended into the psyche's depths, Campbell surveyed the world's mythic landscape from a high vantage point, looking for patterns in the tapestry of human storytelling. Campbell was fundamentally a structuralist in his approach to myth, though not in the rigid linguistic sense of Claude Levi-Strauss. He believed that beneath the surface, differences of cultural myths lay a deep structure, but for Campbell this structure was narrative, not primarily psychological. The hero's journey, as Campbell articulated it, is a story pattern, a narrative template that recurs across cultures because it captures something essential about the human experience of transformation. The hero who hears a call, ventures into unknown territory, faces tests, achieves a boon, and returns transformed. This pattern appears in the myths of Odysseus and Prometheus, in the stories of Buddha and Jesus, in fairy tales and folk stories from every continent. Campbell charted this pattern meticulously, noting that while not every hero myth contains every single stage he identified, the overall pattern remains remarkably consistent. But Campbell understood this pattern differently than Jung understood archetypes. For Campbell, the monomyth is a cultural phenomenon, transmitted and modified through storytelling traditions. It persists because it works, because cultures discover that this narrative pattern effectively communicates the process of growth and transformation that individuals must undergo. Where Jung saw archetypes as structures in the psyche itself, hardwired by evolution, Campbell saw the monomyth as a cultural universal, something that emerges from shared human experience and gets refined and transmitted through story. This is not to say Campbell ignored psychology, far from it. He explicitly drew on Jung's archetypal psychology to explain why the monomyth has such power. The characters that populate the hero's journey, the mentor, the threshold guardian, the goddess, the shapeshifter, the shadow, these correspond to Jungian archetypes, the trials and transformations the hero undergoes parallel psychological processes of growth and individuation. But Campbell's interest lay more in how these psychological realities get encoded into narrative structure that can be publicly shared and culturally transmitted. Campbell emphasized what he called the cosmogonic cycle, the myth of creation, and the hero cycle as the two fundamental patterns in world mythology. Creation myths tell how the world came to be, usually through some kind of sacrifice or division. A primal being is split, chaos is ordered, light is separated from dark. Hero myths tell how an individual undergoes transformation by temporarily leaving the created order, encountering what lies beyond its boundaries, and returning with new knowledge or power. These two patterns, Campbell suggested, served essential functions for traditional societies. The first established the cosmic order and humanity's place in it. The second provided a map for individual transformation within that order. What Campbell particularly emphasized was the journey itself as the transformative element. The hero does not stay home and transform through inner work alone, but must venture forth, cross thresholds, face actual trials. Now, Campbell was sophisticated enough to recognize that these actual trials were often symbolic and internal, but his emphasis remained on the narrative of movement, departure from home, journey through strange lands, return. The geography might be metaphorical, but the sequence of narrative events carried the meaning. This is where Campbell and Jung diverge most significantly in emphasis. Jung might analyze a hero myth by focusing on what each symbol represents. Psychologically, the dragon is the devouring unconscious. The sword is discriminating consciousness. The treasure is the self. The hero's journey maps the individuation process. Campbell would focus on the narrative sequence itself. Why does the hero refuse the call before accepting it? Because humans initially resist transformation. Why must the hero face trials alone? Because transformation requires individual courage. Why must the hero return? Because the journey is incomplete unless its gifts benefit the community. Jung asks what the symbols mean psychologically. Campbell asks what the story teaches about the process of transformation. Campbell's approach made myth immediately accessible and applicable in a way that Jung's deeper but more complex psychological reading sometimes did not. Campbell could stand before an audience and walk them through the hero's journey, showing them how Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings or their own life story followed this pattern. People could see themselves as heroes in their own journeys, recognize the stages, draw courage from knowing that the challenges they faced were part of an age-old pattern. Campbell's interpretation was inspirational, motivational, empowering in direct and practical ways. Jung's approach required more work. You had to learn to attend to dreams, to engage in active imagination, to sit with symbols and let their meanings slowly reveal themselves through meditation and reflection. Jung's method was fundamentally one of depth work, suited to the consulting room and to serious inner exploration. Campbell's method was fundamentally one of breath work, suited to the classroom and to providing frameworks that could guide living. Campbell often spoke of myth as metaphor, as symbolic teaching rather than literal truth. He was fond of saying that myth is something that never was, but always is, not historical events disguised as fantastic stories, but eternal truths expressed through narrative symbols. In this sense, Campbell democratized myth, making it available to modern people who might otherwise dismiss ancient stories as primitive superstition. He helped audiences understand that when a myth speaks of gods and monsters, it is really speaking about psychological and spiritual realities that remain relevant, but Jung would push further, arguing that myth is not merely metaphor, but what he called psychic fact. The archetypes are not just useful ways of thinking about psychological patterns. They are real structures in the psyche, as objectively real in their own domain as molecules are in the physical domain. Dreams are not metaphors, but actual productions of the unconscious, communications from depths of the psyche that have their own reality and autonomy. When Jung described encountering inner figures like Philemon or his anima, he insisted these were not just imaginative projections, but real presences from the objective psyche, the collective unconscious that exists independently of the ego's will. This difference has profound implications. For Campbell, you engage with myth primarily by understanding its narrative pattern and applying that pattern to interpret your life experiences. The pattern is external to you, a cultural inheritance that you can consciously adopt as a framework. For Jung, you engage with myth by recognizing that the mythic is already operative within you, that archetypal forces are already shaping your perceptions, emotions, and behaviors, whether you're conscious of them or not. The task is not to adopt a framework, but to become aware of what is already unconsciously driving you, to bring the unconscious into consciousness. Consider how each would approach a specific mythic motif. Let us take the descent to the underworld, a nearly universal mythic pattern. Stories of Inanna descending to face her dark sister Ereshkigal, of Persephone taken to Hades' realm, of Orpheus seeking Eurydice, of Osiris dismembered and scattered, of Jesus' harrowing hell, of shamanic journeys to the land of the dead, these appear across cultures worldwide. Jung would read such myths as symbolic representations of the ego's necessary encounter with the unconscious. The underworld is the unconscious depths, dark and frightening to ego consciousness, associated with death, because ego fears its own dissolution. The descent is unavoidable in the process of individuation. Sooner or later, life circumstances or inner necessity compel consciousness to confront what it has repressed, denied, or never yet brought into awareness. This is often experienced as depression, as dark night of the soul, as psychological death. But the descent, if properly navigated, leads to renewal. Inanna returns, stripped of her old identity but transformed. Persephone becomes queen of the underworld, gaining depth and authority. The descent yields treasure, whether that be self-knowledge, psychological integration, or the kind of wisdom that only darkness teaches. In clinical work, Jung might help a patient recognize that their depression or crisis was actually a descent, not merely a problem to be solved, but an initiatory process to be undergone. He would explore what parts of the psyche were crying out for attention from the depths. He would work with the dream images and fantasies that arose during this period, treating them as messages from the underworld that needed to be heard. The therapeutic process itself becomes a guided descent, with the analyst serving as psychopomp, the guide between worlds. Campbell would read underworld myths as narrative representations of the necessary withdrawal from ordinary consciousness that transformation requires. In the hero's journey, the descent often corresponds to the approach to the inmost cave and the supreme ordeal. The hero must face death or the fear of death, must go to the place of greatest danger where the dragon lives or where the hardest test awaits. This withdrawal from the ordinary world into a place of trial is necessary because transformation cannot occur within the familiar. You must leave what you know to discover what you don't yet know. Campbell would emphasize the narrative function of each element. Why is the underworld associated with death? Because transformation requires the death of your old self. Why must the hero travel there rather than the underworld coming up? Because you must actively seek transformation. It requires will and courage. Why is there often a guardian or gatekeeper? Because the psyche resists change. You must prove worthy to undergo the ordeal. Campbell might encourage someone facing difficulties to see their situation as the descent phase of their hero journey, to recognize that every hero must face this dark passage, and to find courage in knowing that the pattern promises eventual return with new wisdom. Notice the subtle difference. Jung emphasizes the autonomous reality of the unconscious. The underworld is real. It has its own denizens and rules, and you cannot simply interpret it away. You must actually go there in psychological experience. Campbell emphasizes the narrative structure. The descent is a stage in the journey. It has a function in the overall story arc, and understanding its place in the pattern helps you navigate it. Both perspectives are valuable, but they come from different orientations. This same difference appears in how they understood the collective dimension of myth. Jung's collective unconscious is a psychological reality, a shared substrate of the psyche that all humans inherit, containing the archetypes that shape experience. It is collective not in the sense that we all consciously share it like a cultural tradition, but in the sense that it is the common ground of all human psyches, the foundation upon which individual consciousness builds. You cannot choose whether to have a collective unconscious. It is simply part of being human, like having a body with certain physical structures. Campbell's understanding of myth as collective emphasized its cultural transmission. Myths are collective because cultures create, tell, and retransmit them. The monomyth appears across cultures, not because it is hardwired in a collective unconscious, but because it emerges from universal human experiences, birth, growth, challenge, death, and because effective narrative patterns get adopted and spread. Campbell was very interested in how myths evolved over time, how they migrated between cultures, how they adapted to changing circumstances. He traced the development of mythological consciousness from Paleolithic hunting cultures through Neolithic agricultural societies, through the great civilizations, and into modernity. In his magisterial Masks of God series, Campbell distinguished between mythologies of different eras. Primitive mythologies were tied to immediate environment and survival concerns. Agricultural mythologies introduce themes of death and rebirth tied to seasonal cycles. The great religious mythologies of civilization introduced ethics, metaphysics, and transcendence. Modern secular consciousness has largely abandoned explicit mythology, but still operates with implicit mythic structures. This evolutionary view of mythology was less central to Jung's thinking, which emphasize the timeless operation of archetypes even though their cultural expressions evolved. Yet, despite these differences, Jung and Campbell converged powerfully on certain fundamental insights. Both insisted that myth is not primitive error but profound wisdom. Both argued that modernity's dismissal of myth as superstition represents a catastrophic loss, a severance from dimensions of meaning essential to human flourishing. Both believed that the symbolic and mythic had to be recovered, not as literal belief, but as living connection to depths of experience that rationalism and materialism cannot access. Both Jung and Campbell were deeply concerned with what happens when individuals and cultures lose contact with myth. Jung wrote extensively about the spiritual crisis of Western civilization, how the Enlightenment's elevation of reason and the Industrial Revolution's focus on material production had severed people from their mythic roots. People no longer felt connected to anything larger than themselves. The great symbols of Christianity had lost their numinous power for many. Psychological symptoms proliferated as the psyche cried out for what was missing. Jung saw the rise of totalitarian movements in Europe as partially a result of this spiritual vacuum. When the healthy religious function of the psyche is suppressed, it erupts in demonic forms, entire nations gripped by archetypal possession. Campbell too worried about mythlessness in modern life. He spoke frequently about how traditional cultures provided what he called transparent myths, living symbols through which people experienced connection to transcendent meaning. Modern secular culture offered only opaque myths, symbols that no longer carried numinous power, but had become empty forms. People went through the motions, but felt nothing. The result was what Campbell called the wasteland, borrowing T.S. Eliot's image, a culture of material plenty but spiritual poverty, where individuals could not find the mythic dimension that would give their lives significance. Both offered similar prescriptions. Jung urged individuals to undertake the journey of individuation, to develop conscious relationship with their unconscious depths, to find personal symbols and meanings that connected them to the archetypal dimension. Campbell urged individuals to follow your bliss, to discover what ignited their sense of aliveness and meaning, to recognize their own lives as hero journeys and live them consciously as such. Both prescriptions required looking inward for meaning rather than relying on external authorities or collective solutions. Here we might pause and breathe in the quiet darkness, letting these ideas settle like snow. Two men, two approaches, yet both pointing toward the same essential recognition that human beings are not merely rational animals operating on the surface of existence, but symbol-making and symbol-needing creatures whose deepest life unfolds in a realm of meaning that myth and dream and image express far better than logic and data ever can. Let us go deeper still into their comparative mythology, exploring how they read specific mythic patterns. Consider the widespread myth of the divine child, which fascinated both thinkers. You find it everywhere: Zeus hidden from Kronos, Moses in the bulrushes, Jesus in the manger, Siegfried raised by the smith, Arthur destined to draw the sword, Buddha born from his mother's side. The child is miraculously conceived or protected, often hidden or endangered, raised in secret or obscurity, and eventually revealed as the one who will transform everything. Jung devoted significant attention to the divine child archetype, seeing it as a symbol of emerging new consciousness. The child represents potentiality, the new thing trying to be born in the mason. Psyche. It is divine because it carries the self, the archetype of wholeness, in embryonic form. It is endangered because new consciousness is always vulnerable, the old order represented by the devouring parent, seeks to destroy what would replace it. The child must be hidden and protected until it grows strong enough to fulfill its destiny. When the divine child appears in dreams or fantasies, Jung understood this as a sign that a new attitude or possibility is constellation in the personality, something that could eventually transform the whole structure of consciousness. The motif of the child's miraculous birth or preservation points to the autonomous nature of this process. New consciousness does not arise by ego's will. It comes as a gift from the unconscious, protected by forces beyond ego's control. The old order's attempt to kill the child represents the ego's fear of change, its desire to maintain control even at the cost of strangling new life. Psychological development requires that the child somehow survive and grow despite these threats. Campbell read divine child myths through his narrative lens. The child's miraculous nature marks him or her as the hero of this particular story. The danger and protection in childhood establish the hero's special destiny while creating tension and interest in the narrative. The motif of hidden or humble origins allows for a revelation scene later when the hero's true nature is recognized. Campbell would note how this pattern serves social and psychological functions. It allows ordinary people to imagine themselves as hidden nobility, encourages the belief that current humble circumstances do not determine ultimate destiny, and creates narrative satisfaction through the reversal of fortune. Where Jung sees psychological structure, Campbell sees narrative function. Both perspectives illuminate different aspects of why the divine child appears so frequently in myth. The motif works psychologically because it resonates with archetypal patterns in the psyche. It works narratively because it creates compelling story structures. The two dimensions reinforce each other. Or consider the widespread motif of the wise old man or woman who appears to guide the hero Merlin, Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, or in feminine form the fairy godmother, the good witch, the goddess who grants aid. Jung identified this as the archetype of the wise old man or woman, representing the self's capacity for insight and understanding. When the ego faces a situation beyond its current capacity, the unconscious may present this figure in dreams, offering guidance, teaching, or magical aid. The appearance of such a figure indicates that wisdom is available from the unconscious if consciousness can be receptive to it. In therapy, Jung might explore when and how the wise old man appeared in a patient's dreams. What did the figure say or offer? What part of the patient's own wisdom, currently unavailable to the conscious ego, was this figure representing? The task was to learn to recognize and eventually integrate this wisdom rather than remaining dependent on the inner figure. The wise old man must eventually be recognized as an aspect of the self, not an external authority. Campbell identified this figure as the supernatural aid that appears early in the hero's journey, often just after the hero accepts the call to adventure. This figure provides magical gifts, advice, or training that will help the hero survive the challenges ahead. Campbell emphasized the narrative function. The mentor prepares the hero for what is coming, provides tools and knowledge, and often must eventually step back so the hero can face the supreme ordeal alone. The mentor's wisdom is necessary but not sufficient. The hero must ultimately discover his or her own power. Campbell would note how this pattern appears not just in fantasy literature but in realistic coming-of-age stories. The teacher who recognizes potential, the relative who provides key guidance, the stranger who offers transformative advice. He would encourage people to recognize their own mentors and to understand themselves as potentially mentors to others. The pattern is not merely psychological but social, describing real roles people play in each other's development. Both readings enrich understanding. The mentor is both an archetypal potential within the psyche, Jung, and a narrative role in the social world, Campbell. The two dimensions interweave external mentors, activate internal wisdom. Internal wisdom helps us recognize external guides. Let us turn now to one of Campbell's most distinctive contributions, which both built upon and diverged from Jung, his emphasis on the different mythological systems of different eras and cultures. Campbell identified what he called the four functions of mythology: the mystical function, inspiring awe at the mystery of existence; the cosmological function, explaining the shape of the universe; the sociological function, supporting and validating social order; and the psychological function, guiding individuals through life transitions. Traditional mythologies integrated all four functions seamlessly. Modern culture had fragmented them. Moreover, Campbell distinguished between what he called folk mythologies and creative mythologies. Folk mythologies are collectively generated, growing organically over generations as a culture's shared symbolic system. Creative mythologies are produced by individual artists: Dante, Milton, Goethe, Joyce. In traditional societies, folk mythology predominated. In modern times, creative mythology becomes more important as shared folk systems fragment. Campbell also emphasized crucial differences between Eastern and Western mythological orientations. Western mythology, rooted in Judaism and Christianity, tends toward historical thinking. Myths are about events that happened at particular times, creating salvation history, with human life oriented toward future fulfillment. Eastern mythology, particularly in Hinduism and Buddhism, tends toward eternal return and mystical transcendence. The gods and heroes represent eternal principles. Time is cyclical rather than linear, and enlightenment means escaping the wheel of birth and death. These distinctions interested Campbell greatly because he lived and taught in a period of increasing cultural exchange when Eastern and Western traditions were meeting and mixing in unprecedented ways. He saw potential for new synthetic mythologies drawing from both traditions, combining the Western emphasis on individual historical existence with the Eastern recognition of eternal patterns and mystical consciousness. Jung also distinguished between different cultural orientations, but with different emphasis. His exploration of Eastern thought, particularly in his commentaries on the Tibetan Book of the Dead and The Secret of the Golden Flower, emphasized both the profound wisdom of Eastern traditions and their radical difference from Western psychology. The East sought to dissolve the ego into universal consciousness. The West needed to strengthen ego consciousness and then bring it into right relationship with the unconscious. Jung worried about Westerners trying to adopt Eastern practices without recognizing that these practices arose from and were suited to very different psychological conditions. A Westerner practicing Eastern meditation without adequate ego development might risk psychotic dissolution rather than enlightenment. Where Campbell celebrated cross-cultural exchange and synthesis, Jung counseled respect for differences and warned against superficial borrowing. Yet both recognized that exposure to different mythological systems could be liberating, showing that one's own cultural assumptions were not universal and opening possibilities for new understanding. Let us consider now how each man understood the relationship between myth and religion, a crucial but subtle distinction. Campbell frequently quoted from the Upanishads and spoke of all the gods and goddesses as masks of the same transcendent reality. He tended toward a universalist position. All religions at their mystical core pointed toward the same truth, though expressed through different cultural symbols. The particular mythology you practiced was less important than recognizing its symbolic nature and using it to connect with transcendent meaning. Campbell's oft-repeated phrase, "follow your bliss," suggested that authentic spiritual life required finding what genuinely inspired you rather than conforming to inherited tradition. This perspective could seem irreverent or even hostile to traditional religion, and Campbell did critique what he saw as the literalization and rigidification of living myth into dead dogma. When religious institutions insisted that their particular symbols were uniquely and literally true rather than culturally specific expressions of universal patterns, Campbell saw them as committing what he called category error, confusing the historically contingent symbol with the transcendent reality it pointed toward. Jung's relationship with religion was more complex and paradoxical. He was deeply knowledgeable about Christianity, trained as he was in a family of Protestant ministers. He took religious experience with utmost seriousness, but understood it psychologically. For Jung, religious symbols and experiences were real and valid not because they referred to external supernatural beings, but because they expressed authentic experiences of the numinous dimension of the psyche itself. God was a psychological reality, an archetypal image of the self, and religious experiences were genuine encounters with the unconscious in its numinous aspect. This position satisfied neither traditional believers, who wanted God to be objectively real, independent of the psyche, nor atheists, who wanted religion dismissed as illusion. Jung insisted he was not saying that God was merely psychological, rather, he was saying that the psyche itself has a dimension that is experienced as divine, that legitimately deserves religious language and reverence. The mysterium tremendum that Otto described, the overwhelming sense of sacred presence, was a real experience, even if you understood it psychologically rather than theologically. Jung valued the symbolic richness of Christianity and worried about its erosion in modern secular culture. The central Christian symbols, incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, Trinity, Virgin Mother, expressed profound psychological truths about the self, sacrifice, transformation, and wholeness. When these symbols lost their power, people lost access to dimensions of experience these symbols mediated. Yet Jung also criticized Christianity for repressing certain aspects of the psyche, particularly sexuality, embodiment, and the dark or evil aspects that the tradition had projected onto Satan rather than integrating into the divine image. Where Campbell advocated freely drawing from multiple traditions to create personal mythologies, Jung thought people needed deep connection to their own cultural traditions' symbols, even while outgrowing literal interpretations. You could not simply adopt symbols from foreign traditions. You had to work with the symbols that already lived in your unconscious through your cultural inheritance, bringing them from collective to individual significance through inner work. Both men would agree, however, that living religiosity was better than dead orthodoxy, that authentic symbol was better than empty form, that direct experience mattered more than inherited belief. Both wanted to help people recover genuine connection to the sacred, whether understood psychologically or mythologically. Now let us explore a specific case to see how their different approaches might work in practice. Imagine a person, call her Sarah, who comes seeking help in a moment of life crisis. She is 42 years old, successful in her career, but increasingly feeling that her life is empty and meaningless. She has begun having recurring dreams of being in a dark forest, lost, sometimes pursued by threatening figures, sometimes encountering strange animals or mysterious buildings. If Sarah had come to Jung, he would have focused immediately on the dreams, asking for detailed accounts, exploring associations, amplifying the symbols by connecting them to parallel images in mythology. Art and alchemy, the dark forest, the loss of direction, the threatening figures, these would all be understood as representing Sarah's current psychological state. The dark forest is a classical symbol of the unconscious, of being in a place where ego consciousness cannot find its way. The threatening figures might be shadow aspects, parts of herself she has rejected or neglected that are now demanding recognition. The animals and buildings are potential guides and goals, messages from the unconscious about new directions. Jung would help Sarah understand that her midlife crisis was actually an invitation from the unconscious to begin the process of individuation. The first half of life is typically devoted to ego development, establishing oneself in career and relationships. But around midlife, if this has been successful, a different task emerges: the need to develop relationship with the unconscious, to become who you uniquely are rather than simply fulfilling social roles. The unconscious is calling Sarah into the dark forest, asking her to leave behind the mapped territory of conventional success and discover what she personally finds meaningful. The work would involve active imagination and careful attention to dreams. Jung might suggest Sarah imaginatively enter the forest and see what happens, or have dialogues with the dream figures. Over time, patterns would emerge. Perhaps Sarah would discover that she had sacrificed authentic desires for external success. Perhaps she would encounter unlived aspects of her personality. Perhaps she would gradually find symbols of the self, indications of the wholeness she was meant to become. The process would be slow, deep, unique to Sarah, oriented not toward solving the problem, but toward transformation through relationship with unconscious contents. If Sarah had come to Campbell, though, we must remember Campbell was not a therapist. He might approach her situation differently. He would likely help her see her crisis as a call to adventure in her own hero's journey. The first 42 years of her life were the ordinary world. Now she is receiving the call to something more, something beyond conventional success. The dark forest in her dreams represents the unknown territory she must enter. The threatening figures are threshold guardians, the resistances and fears she must face to begin the journey. Campbell might ask, what genuinely excites Sarah? What makes her feel alive? What she has always wanted to do but felt she couldn't or shouldn't? Follow your bliss would mean identifying what gives her sense of meaning and purpose, then taking steps to incorporate that into her life, even if it means leaving behind security or social approval. The crisis is not a problem, but an opportunity, the necessary disruption that begins every hero's journey. Campbell would remind Sarah that every hero initially refuses the call, feeling unworthy or afraid. This is normal. But if she continues refusing, her life will remain in the wasteland, comfortable but empty. If she accepts the call, adventures await. She will face trials and discover abilities she didn't know she possessed. She will find mentors who help her. She will approach and survive the supreme ordeal, whatever that turns out to be for her particular journey. And eventually she will return to ordinary life transformed, bringing gifts that can help others. The emphasis would be on action, movement, engagement with life, rather than primarily inner work. Campbell might recommend that Sarah read widely in mythology, find stories that speak to her situation, let those stories guide and inspire her. He might encourage her to take concrete steps, quit the draining job, start the creative project, travel to the place she has always dreamed of. The dreams are less material for analysis than confirmation that her inner hero is ready to depart. Notice how different, yet complementary these approaches are. Jung goes inward, Campbell goes outward. Jung emphasizes careful relationship with the unconscious. Campbell emphasizes bold engagement with life. Jung works with symbols as things in themselves to be meditated upon. Campbell works with symbols as guides for action. Jung is cautious about premature movement, knowing the unconscious must be given time to reveal itself. Campbell encourages movement, knowing that the journey teaches as you travel. Both would likely help Sarah if she was open to their particular approach. For some people in her situation, Jung's method would resonate more deeply, offering the inner grounding and symbolic depth they need. For others, Campbell's method would be more helpful, giving permission and framework to make bold changes. The question is not which is right, but which serves this particular person at this particular moment. This brings us to one of the most important areas where Jung and Campbell diverge their different emphases on interior versus exterior transformation. Jung's entire psychology is fundamentally introverted in both the technical and colloquial sense. The real work happens inside. External changes may follow from inner transformation, but they are secondary. You can change jobs, relationships, locations, without undergoing genuine psychological development. Conversely, you can remain in the same external circumstances while undergoing profound inner transformation. Dreams, fantasies, active imagination, symbolic work, these are the primary media of individuation. Jung would say that if Sarah rushes into external changes without doing inner work, she will simply recreate the same psychological patterns in new circumstances. The dark forest is inside her psyche. She cannot escape it by changing her address. She must enter it consciously, explore it, understand what it contains. Only when she has integrated previously unconscious contents will her outer life naturally align with her inner wholeness. Campbell's psychology is more extroverted, more oriented toward life in the world. While he certainly valued inner work, his emphasis was on the hero's journey as movement through stages, encounters with others, tests and trials in the world. The transformation happens through experience, through facing challenges, through venturing into unknown territory. Yes, there is an inner dimension to this, but it manifests through engagement with life, not withdrawal from it. Campbell would encourage Sarah not to overthink, but to act, to follow the call, even without knowing where it leads. The path reveals itself by walking it. You cannot plan your transformation. You must live it. The dark forest in her dreams is beckoning her toward forests in waking life, new territories to explore literally and metaphorically. Move toward what calls you, and trust that meaning will emerge. This difference reflects their different life experiences and professional contexts. Jung spent decades in the consulting room, working intensively with individuals in analysis, witnessing how deeply unconscious patterns operate and how much inner work transformation requires. His own confrontation with the unconscious after his break with Freud was primarily internal, worked through visions and active imagination rather than external adventure. He emerged from those years convinced that the real drama unfolds in the psyche's depths. Campbell spent decades in the classroom and with books, teaching young people on the threshold of adult life, reading about heroes in mythologies worldwide. His own defining experience was the 5 years in Woodstock reading 9 hours a day, an intensive but primarily intellectual and cultural exploration. He emerged convinced that the stories we tell ourselves and others shape how we live, that finding the right narrative frame empowers action, that seeing your life as hero journey gives courage to take risks. Neither position excludes the other. They are different emphases along a spectrum. The deepest wisdom probably requires both inner work and outer action, symbolic contemplation and bold engagement, descent into the unconscious and adventure in the world. Jung and Campbell between them offer both directions, and perhaps their being read together rather than in isolation serves psychological health better than following either exclusively. Let us reflect now on how both men understood the relationship between the individual and the collective, a crucial theme in depth psychology. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious posits that beneath individual psychology lies a shared foundation. Yet the collective unconscious is not a collective consciousness. Each person experiences their own individual consciousness and personal unconscious. The collective unconscious is encountered individually through dreams, fantasies, and inner figures that draw on archetypal patterns. Individuation is thus paradoxically both deeply individual and deeply universal. You become most truly yourself by connecting to what is most universally human. Jung emphasized that consciousness is always individual. There is no group consciousness in his psychology. Only individuals who may share similar conscious contents through cultural transmission. The collective aspect exists at the unconscious level, in the inherited archetypal structures that predispose humans to certain experiences. When people in a group become highly emotional and identified with collective contents, as in political rallies or religious revivals, they are not experiencing true collective consciousness, but rather possession by archetypal energies, what Jung called participation mystique, or identification with the collective unconscious. In such states, individual consciousness is diminished, overtaken by archetypal forces. This is why Jung placed such emphasis on individuation. Becoming more conscious means differentiating yourself from both personal complexes and collective identifications. You must become an individual who can contain archetypal energies without being possessed by them, who can participate in culture without being dissolved into mass psychology. Campbell's relationship with individual and collective was different. He was very interested in how traditional societies used myth collectively through rituals, festivals, shared stories that everyone knew. These collective practices served to incorporate individuals into the social order, to mark life transitions, to renew cosmic order. In traditional society, you did not need to create personal meaning. The culture provided it through living mythology. Modernity's loss of collective myth means individuals must now create personal mythologies. This offers freedom but also burden. You must discover for yourself what previous generations received from culture. Campbell saw this as both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, you are no longer bound by restrictive traditional roles and can follow your own bliss. On the other hand, without clear cultural guidance, you can easily become lost in the wasteland, never finding meaningful direction. Campbell was somewhat more optimistic than Jung about the possibility of conscious myth creation. He thought artists, writers, and ordinary people could craft new myths, drawing from the world's traditions, finding or creating symbols that spoke to contemporary experience. Jung was more cautious, believing you cannot simply create symbols, Consciously, real symbols must arise from the unconscious, carrying numinous power that conscious invention cannot manufacture. You can recognize and work with symbols that arise from within, but you cannot decide to make something symbolic. Both would agree, however, on the danger of collective possession by unconscious forces. Jung witnessed this in the rise of Nazism, which he understood as archetypal possession on a mass scale, the god Wotan rising from the Germanic unconscious, possessing an entire nation. Campbell witnessed similar phenomena and understood them as the dark side of mythology when myths are literalized and used to demonize others, when the sociological function of myth becomes rigid and oppressive, when symbols of transformation are perverted into justifications for violence. The antidote both offered was consciousness becoming aware of how myths and symbols operate, understanding their psychological functions, refusing to be swept away by unconscious identifications. Jung advocated individual analysis and inner work. Campbell advocated education in comparative mythology and understanding of symbolic language. Both paths aimed at creating individuals who could relate to myth consciously rather than being unconsciously driven by it. As you rest now in the darkness of this long night, let your mind drift to a particular image. Both Jung and Campbell pondered the mandala, the sacred circle. Jung discovered mandalas arising spontaneously in the dreams and drawings of his patients, often during periods of crisis and transformation. The mandala represented the self, the archetype of wholeness, psyche's spontaneous attempt to create order from chaos, to integrate disparate elements into unified structure. He collected mandala images from many traditions, Tibetan Buddhist thangkas, Christian rose windows, Hindu, yantras, Native American sand paintings, and saw in their worldwide presence evidence of the self-archetype's universal operation. For Jung, mandala creation was a natural part of individuation, especially in middle life. When the personality threatened to fragment or when profound transformation was underway, the psyche produced mandalas as healing images, containers for the process. Jung encouraged patients to draw or paint mandalas, finding that this practice had therapeutic effects even when the person did not understand the symbolism. The very act of creating centered, symmetrical images had ordering effects on the chaotic psyche. Campbell encountered mandalas primarily as cultural artifacts, cosmic diagrams mapping sacred geography. He was fascinated by how many cultures created circular sacred spaces, stone circles, medicine wheels, ritual enclosures, and understood these as literal enactments of the mandala principle, creating temporary worlds where mythic and everyday reality interpenetrated. The circle marked sacred space, differentiated from profane surroundings within which transformation could occur. Campbell emphasized the mandala as map of the cosmos and the self's place within it. At the center is the axis mundi, the world tree or mountain, connecting earth and heaven. The four directions radiate out, often associated with colors, elements, seasons, gods. The boundary circle contains and protects while also excluding. Within the mandala's sacred geometry, the mythic structures of reality become visible and navigable. Both understood the mandala as wholeness, but again with different emphasis. Jung focused on its psychological function. The mandala arises from the self and helps contain the individuation process. Campbell focused on its cosmological and ritual function. The mandala orders space and time, creating a frame within which sacred action can occur. Yet their insights converge beautifully. The mandalas that arise spontaneously in individual psychology and the mandalist cultures create as sacred diagrams are manifestations of the same impulse, the need to create order, to find center, to orient oneself in relation to the whole. Whether drawn by a troubled patient in Zurich, or painted by a Tibetan monk, or built in stones on the American plains, the mandala expresses humanity's perennial quest for wholeness and orientation. Let us move now toward the territory where Jung and Campbell most obviously converged. Their shared conviction that modern Western culture had lost something essential by dismissing myth as primitive error. Both spent their lives trying to help restore appreciation for myth's wisdom while translating that wisdom into terms modern consciousness could accept. Jung approached this as a clinician, witnessing the suffering caused by mythlessness. Patients came to him with neuroses and psychoses that he increasingly understood as symptoms of spiritual crisis, the psyche, starved for symbolic life, for connection to the numinous, for participation in meanings larger than personal ego concerns. Modern materialism and rationalism had stripped the world of enchantment. Science explained how things worked, but not what they meant. Traditional religion still existed, but had lost vitality for many people, reduced to moralistic rules or hollow rituals. Jung argued that the religious function of the psyche was a natural given, as fundamental as sexuality or hunger. Humans need connection to the numinous dimension, need to feel part of a meaningful cosmos, need symbols that connect them to depths beyond ego consciousness. When this function is not met through conscious religion or symbolic life, it does not disappear, but rather manifests in destructive ways as addiction, as compulsion, as possession by unconscious forces. The 20th century's catastrophes, the world wars, totalitarianism, atomic weapons, reflected not just political failures, but spiritual crisis. Humanity disconnected from symbolic and mythic dimensions that could contain and guide its enormous powers. Jung's advocacy for myth was therefore therapeutic in the broadest sense. He wanted to help individuals reconnect with the symbolic life, primarily through attention to dreams and active imagination. But he also hoped that cultural renewal might occur if enough individuals undertook this work. He corresponded with theologians, wrote extensively on religious symbolism, and even attempted to influence cultural understanding through works like his late Answer to Job, which offered a psychological reading of God's development through the Hebrew Bible and into Christianity. Campbell approached the same problem as an educator and cultural critic. He witnessed young Americans in the mid-20th century struggling with the same loss of meaning that concerned Jung. The old certainties, religious, social, even familial, were eroding rapidly. The post-war world offered material prosperity but spiritual confusion. Without living myths to guide them, people either clung desperately to literalistic religion or drifted in secular meaninglessness. Campbell's response was to teach comparative mythology in ways that revealed the universal patterns and perennial wisdom contained in the world's traditions. If Christianity no longer spoke to someone, perhaps Hindu mythology would. If Western heroic myths felt foreign, perhaps Native American or African or Asian stories would resonate. The key was recognizing that all mythologies were pointing toward the same essential truths about human experience, transformation, and meaning. By understanding this, people could find their own paths to the sacred, rather than either clinging to traditions that no longer lived for them or dismissing all myth as irrelevant. Campbell's famous directive, "Follow your bliss," came from this conviction. When you follow what genuinely excites and enlivens you, you align with, the deepest truths of your being. You discover your own hero's journey rather than living someone else's script. This was Campbell's prescription for mythlessness, not to adopt someone else's myth literally, but to recognize the mythic dimension in your own life and dare to live it. Both men thus offered paths back to myth Jung through depth, psychology, and inner work, Campbell through comparative study and conscious life choices. Both emphasized that myth must be understood symbolically rather than literally. Neither advocated primitive regression or rejection of modern knowledge. Both wanted to help people become more conscious and more connected to depth simultaneously. They also shared a critique of scientism, the reduction of all knowledge to what can be measured and empirically verified. Not science itself, which both respected, but the philosophical position that nothing is real except what science can explain. This position, both argued, made no room for meaning, value, beauty, purpose, the sacred dimensions that are not objectively measurable, but are nonetheless essential to human life. Jung pointed out that scientism commits a category error, confusing an epistemological method with a metaphysical claim. Science is a particular way of knowing, well suited to studying physical causality and mechanism. But it is not the only form of knowledge. Symbolic knowledge, aesthetic knowledge, moral knowledge, spiritual knowledge. These operate by different principles and cannot be reduced to scientific terms without losing what is essential to them. Campbell made similar arguments, noting that myth operates in a different domain than scientific hypothesis. When a myth says the world was created from the body of a slain giant, it is not making a claim about physical cosmology that science can falsify. It is expressing something about the sacrificial nature of creation, about how order emerges from chaos, about the sacredness of the world. 2. Judge it as bad science is to completely miss its meaning and function. Both Jung and Campbell can be seen as part of a broader intellectual movement in the 20th century that tried to chart a middle way between rigid traditionalism and reductive materialism. This movement included figures like Mircea Eliade in religious studies, Paul Tillich in theology, Rudolf Otto in phenomenology, and many others. What united them was the conviction that the sacred, the symbolic, and the mythic were real dimensions of human experience that needed to be taken seriously on their own terms. Neither collapsed into scientific naturalism, nor defended as supernatural dogma. Jung's terminology of archetypes and collective unconscious, Campbell's concept of the monomyth, these were attempts to speak about perennial human experiences and patterns in language that modern consciousness could accept. You didn't have to believe in literal gods or miracles to take myth seriously. You could understand it, psychologically and anthropologically, while still recognizing its profound truth and necessity. Critics of both men have sometimes accused them of reducing myth to something less than what traditional believers experienced. When you say the gods are archetypes or metaphors rather than real beings, haven't you explained away the sacred? Both Jung and Campbell would reject this accusation. They would argue that understanding myth psychologically or symbolically does not diminish, but rather deepens appreciation of its truth. The psychological reality of archetypes is no less real than physical reality, just different in kind. The metaphorical truth of myth is no less true than literal fact, just true in a different register. This is perhaps the most important gift both men offered to modernity: permission to take myth seriously without requiring literal belief, a way to be both intellectually honest and spiritually engaged, both modern and connected to ancient wisdom. Whether they fully succeeded in this complex task remains debatable, but the attempt itself was valuable and continues to be relevant. As we move deeper into the night, and this long meditation draws toward its conclusion, let us reflect on what the dialogue between Jung and Campbell reveals about the nature of the psyche and human existence itself. What arises when these two perspectives interact? When the clinician and the mythographer's insights merge and diverge, illuminate and complicate each other. First, their dialogue reveals the multidimensional nature of myth. Myth is simultaneously psychological reality and cultural phenomenon, inner structure and narrative pattern, personal medicine and collective wisdom. Jung and Campbell between them explore these different dimensions, showing that myth cannot be reduced to any single interpretation. It must be understood through multiple lenses simultaneously. This multiplicity reflects the psyche's own complexity. Human consciousness is not a simple thing, but a strange integration of multiple levels and dimensions, biological drives, personal memories, cultural conditioning, archetypal patterns, spiritual longings, conscious intentions. Any adequate psychology must account for this complexity rather than reducing it to a single principle. Jung's emphasis on the individual psyche's depths and Campbell's emphasis on cultural narrative patterns are both necessary for full understanding. The psyche is shaped from within by inherited archetypal structures and from without by cultural stories and social roles. Inner and outer, individual and collective, depth and surface, these are not opposites but complementary dimensions of the whole. Their dialogue also illuminates the relationship between knowledge and transformation. Jung emphasized that real psychological change requires experience, not just intellectual understanding. You must actually encounter unconscious contents, feel their numinous power, struggle with their integration. Reading about archetypes is not the same as experiencing archetypal dreams or visions. Analysis is effective not because it provides correct interpretations, but because it facilitates real encounters with unconscious aspects of the personality. Campbell emphasized that myth works by providing maps and models that guide action. Knowing the hero's journey pattern helps you recognize and navigate your own life transitions. The stories give courage by showing that others have faced similar challenges and survived. Understanding myth intellectually can be transformative because it reframes experience in ways that empower different choices. Both are right, and their insights complement each other. Some people are more helped by Jung's approach, going deep into dreams and symbols, sitting with what arises from within. Others are more helped by Campbell's approach, finding the story they are living, recognizing its pattern, choosing consciously how to engage it. Both paths can lead to transformation if pursued genuinely. The dialogue between Jung and Campbell also highlights the tension between universal and particular, between what is the same across all humans and cultures and what is unique to individuals and traditions. Jung's archetypes are universal structures, but they manifest differently in each person and culture. Campbell's monomyth is a universal pattern, but each culture tells it with different emphases and meanings. This suggests that human nature involves both universal and particular dimensions. We share fundamental structures of psyche and experience. All humans are born, develop, face challenges, seek meaning, and die. These commonalities generate similar myths and symbols across cultures. But we are also irreducibly individual and culturally specific. No two people or traditions are identical. Psychology must honor both the universal patterns and the unique manifestations. Perhaps most profoundly, the dialogue between Jung and Campbell reveals the relationship between consciousness and meaning. Both men, in different ways, argued that consciousness is not enough for human flourishing. We are not merely thinking animals who need to understand the world rationally. We are meaning-seeking, symbol-making creatures who need to feel that existence makes sense, that our lives participate in something larger than themselves, that the universe is not indifferent mechanism, but alive with significance. This need for meaning is not a weakness or illusion to be overcome through philosophical sophistication. It is a fundamental characteristic of human consciousness, perhaps the fundamental characteristic. When meaning is absent, life becomes unbearable, regardless of material circumstances. When meaning is present, people can endure extraordinary suffering and challenge. Myth provides meaning by connecting individual experience to eternal patterns, by showing that your struggles are not merely personal failures, but participation in archetypal dramas, by revealing the sacred within the ordinary. Whether you access this through Jungian depth work or Campbellian narrative frameworks matters less than that you find your way to it somehow. Both Jung and Campbell also grappled with the question of evil, suffering, and the dark dimensions of existence. Jung's concept of the shadow, the rejected and repressed aspects of personality, insists that wholeness requires integrating darkness rather than only identifying with light. The process of individuation necessarily involves recognizing one's own capacity for evil, aggression, and destruction. These must be acknowledged and contained rather than projected onto others or denied. Jung's late work particularly emphasized the problem of evil in the Western religious tradition. Christianity's tendency to split good and evil absolutely, placing God on the side of good and Satan on the side of evil, creates psychological difficulties. It encourages repression of shadow elements and projection of evil outward, rather than recognition that the capacity for both good and evil exists within every person and even within the image of the divine. Campbell approached evil and suffering somewhat differently, through the lens of tragedy and the hero's necessary wounds. In the hero's journey, suffering is not random but meaningful. The trials shape the hero, the wounds teach wisdom, the descent into darkness precedes the renewal. Mythology acknowledges suffering's reality while insisting it can be transformative rather than merely destructive. Campbell was particularly interested in myths that presented suffering as inherent to existence, the Buddhist first noble truth that life is dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactorious, the Hindu concept of maya, illusion, from which one seeks release. These traditions did not promise to eliminate suffering, but offered ways to transform one's relationship to it, to find equanimity or enlightenment. Despite inevitable pain, both men thus rejected simple optimism while also rejecting nihilistic despair. Evil and suffering are real, permanent features of existence, not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be faced with consciousness and courage. Myth helps by providing frameworks within which suffering can be understood as potentially meaningful rather than merely absurd. The question of how to live, given the reality of suffering and death, preoccupied both thinkers. Jung's answer emphasized individuation, becoming who you uniquely are, fulfilling your particular potential, integrating conscious and unconscious dimensions into greater wholeness. This does not eliminate suffering, but gives it meaning as part of the journey toward the self. Campbell's answer emphasized the hero's journey, accepting the call to adventure, facing challenges with courage, finding and bringing back the boon that can help others. This does not eliminate suffering, but frames it as the necessary trials through which transformation occurs. Both answers involve accepting rather than fleeing from life's difficulties, finding meaning in the struggle itself, and connecting personal experience to larger patterns. Both require consciousness, the ability to reflect on your experience, recognize patterns, make choices rather than merely react. Both also require a certain faith, not necessarily religious belief, but trust that the process leads somewhere meaningful even when you cannot yet see the destination. Let us reflect now on the particular way each man understood transformation, that central concern of both depth psychology and mythology. For Jung, transformation centered on the concept of individuation, that lifelong process of becoming more conscious and more whole. Individuation is not about achieving perfection or eliminating problems, but about gradually integrating previously unconscious contents into consciousness, expanding awareness to include more of the psyche's totality. This process typically follows a pattern Jung observed repeatedly. In the first half of life, the task is ego development, establishing identity, career, relationships, learning to function effectively in the world. If this is successful, around midlife, a shift occurs. The ego has developed adequately, and now the self begins calling for attention. People experience this as crisis, restlessness, dissatisfaction, sense that despite external success, something essential is missing. If the person responds to this call, rather than defending against it, the individuation process proper begins. Dreams become more numinous and significant, presenting encounters with archetypal figures. The shadow appears, requiring recognition of rejected aspects. The anima, or animus, emerges, leading toward integration of contrasexual dimensions. Other archetypal figures arise: wise, old man, great mother, divine child, each representing aspects of the self-seeking consciousness. The process moves in spirals rather than straight lines, circling around the self repeatedly, each time from a different angle, gradually approaching but never fully grasping wholeness. Integration occurs not through willful effort but through careful attention and dialogue with what arises from the unconscious. The ego must become strong enough to encounter the unconscious without being overwhelmed, but humble enough not to claim mastery over it. For Jung, this process was sacred, a modern form of initiation that civilization no longer provided through collective rituals. Analysis could facilitate it, but could not force it. The analyst served as companion and witness, helping the patient attend to what emerged from within. Campbell understood transformation through the narrative structure of the hero's journey. You begin in the ordinary world, constrained by familiar patterns. The call to adventure disrupts normalcy, inviting you into unknown territory. After initial refusal, you cross the threshold into the special world where different rules apply. There you face trials that test and develop you, receive aid from mentors and allies, encounter temptations and enemies. The climax comes in the supreme ordeal, the encounter with death or greatest fear that you must face alone. Surviving this ordeal, you receive the boon, treasure, knowledge, power, enlightenment, whatever the particular story requires. But the journey is not complete until you return to the ordinary world, reintegrating with society and sharing what you have gained. Campbell emphasized that every life contains multiple hero journeys, not just one. Each significant transition, adolescence, first love, career beginning, parenthood, loss, retirement, can follow this pattern. Recognizing which stage you are in helps you understand what is required and what will come next. The transformation occurs through the journey itself, through actively engaging with challenges rather than avoiding them. You discover resources within yourself you did not know you possessed. You learn skills, You gain perspective. Most importantly, you die to your old self and are reborn, transformed. The person who returns from the journey is not who departed, though they may look the same externally. Notice how these two models of transformation relate. Jung's individuation is an interior process, though it may have exterior consequences. Campbell's hero's journey is a narrative structure that can describe interior or exterior experiences. Jung emphasizes the unconscious as the source of transformation. Campbell emphasizes the call and journey as the context for transformation. Both agree transformation requires leaving familiar territory, facing challenges, achieving something new, and integrating it. Their combined wisdom suggests transformation requires both inner and outer dimensions. You must both attend to what arises from within and actively engage with life's challenges. You must both do psychological work and live courageously. The deepest transformations involve both descent into unconscious depths and adventures in the world. As we drift further into the quiet darkness of this contemplation, let us consider how Jung and Campbell each understood the role of the guide or helper in transformation. For Jung, the analyst served as a crucial presence in the individuation process, though the analyst's role was paradoxical. The analyst must be experienced enough to recognize archetypal processes and wise enough not to interfere with their natural unfolding. Too directive an approach would substitute the analyst's consciousness for the patient's own emerging awareness. Too passive an approach would leave the patient lost in unconscious contents without adequate guidance. Jung emphasized that the analyst must have done their own inner work, confronted their own shadow, worked with their own dreams and fantasies. An unanalyzed analyst would unconsciously impose their complexes on patients or fail to recognize important material. The analyst must also guard against identification with the wise old man archetype, must remember they are human and fallible, accompanying the patient but not claiming superior knowledge. The analytical relationship itself becomes a container for transformation, what Jung called the temenos, the sacred space within which deep work can occur. Within this space, transference and countertransference, the feelings patient and analyst develop toward each other, become material for examination and understanding rather than dangers to be avoided. The relationship itself becomes an alchemical vessel within which transformation occurs. Campbell spoke less about specific therapeutic relationships since he was not a therapist, but he emphasized the archetypal role of the mentor in the hero's journey. The mentor appears early in the journey, after the hero accepts the call, and provides supernatural aid, magical gifts, training, advice, encouragement. The mentor represents the wisdom the hero needs but does not yet possess, the knowledge that the journey will require. Importantly, the mentor cannot complete the journey for the hero. Eventually, the hero must face the supreme ordeal alone, without the mentor's protection. Indeed, sometimes the mentor must die or disappear to force the hero to rely on their own resources. The mentor's ultimate gift is not protection but empowerment, teaching the hero to access their own wisdom and courage. Campbell encouraged people to recognize their mentors in life and to understand themselves as potential mentors to others. The pattern is not merely mythological but describes real relationships through which wisdom and courage pass between generations. Honoring your mentors and accepting responsibility to guide others when appropriate are both essential to psychological and spiritual maturity. Both perspectives illuminate the mystery of how one person can assist another's development without imposing their own vision. Whether as analyst or mentor, the guide must serve the other person's unique journey rather than replicating their own. This requires both knowledge of universal patterns and recognition of individual uniqueness, both confidence in one's own experience and humility before another's mystery. Let us contemplate now one final area where Jung and Campbell both contributed profound insights for the relationship between psychological development and the stages of life. Both recognize that different life periods present different challenges and opportunities, requiring different orientations and work. Jung's psychology of the second half of life was particularly original. While Freud focused primarily on childhood and early development, Jung recognized that around age 40, a fundamental shift typically occurs. If the first half of life is devoted to ego development, establishing yourself in the world, building career, forming relationships, raising children, the second half calls for something different. The ego has developed. Now it is time to develop relationship with the self, to become an individual rather than merely fulfill social roles. This shift often arrives as crisis. What worked in the first half of life stops working. Career success feels empty. Relationships become stale. Questions of meaning and mortality press in. Many people respond by trying harder at what they were already doing, but this only increases distress. What is needed is a fundamental reorientation, turning attention inward, beginning the conscious individuation process. Jung noted that many religious and mythological traditions recognize this life transition. In Hinduism, the stages of life explicitly acknowledge that after the householder phase of career and family, one enters the forest dweller phase of spiritual seeking, and eventually the renunciate phase. Christianity honored this through monastic traditions that withdrew from worldly concerns to pursue contemplation. Modern secular culture largely ignores this transition, expecting people to remain productive and engaged in the same ways throughout life. But the psyche has its own developmental logic. In the second half of life, the unconscious presses more insistently for attention. Dreams become more numinous. Synchronicities multiply. Questions about death and meaning cannot be postponed. If this call is answered, the later years can become the most psychologically and spiritually rich period of life. If it is refused, this period becomes a long decline into bitterness, rigidity, or meaninglessness. Campbell approached the life cycle through his study of traditional initiation rituals and coming-of-age myths. He was particularly interested in how pre-modern cultures provided ritual support for life transitions from childhood to adulthood, from unmarried to married, from warrior to elder. These rituals enacted the death of the old self and birth of the new, providing both individual and community with clear markers of transformation. Modern culture has largely lost these rituals, leaving individuals to navigate transitions without cultural support or understanding. Adolescence becomes prolonged confusion rather than clear initiation into adulthood. Marriage loses its transformative meaning. Old age has no honored role. Campbell saw this ritual poverty as contributing to modern psychological difficulties. His work on the hero's journey was partly an attempt to provide a framework individuals could use to understand and navigate their own transitions. If culture no longer provides rituals, at least understanding the mythic pattern might help people recognize what is happening in their own lives and respond appropriately. Both Jung and Campbell thus emphasize that psychological development does not end with childhood or even young adulthood, but continues throughout life. Each stage has its own tasks and gifts. Trying to remain in an earlier stage rather than accepting the new developmental call, leads to stagnation and suffering. Consciousness means recognizing where you are in the life journey and accepting what that stage requires. Their combined wisdom suggests that a complete human life follows a pattern something like this: childhood and youth for ego development and learning to function in the world, young adulthood for establishing career and relationships, midlife for the turn inward and beginning conscious individuation, later adulthood for harvesting wisdom and preparing for death, old age for the final integration and acceptance of mortality. Each stage builds on previous ones while also transcending them. This pattern is not rigid, but recognizes a natural developmental logic. Of course, individual lives vary enormously in details. Some people begin inner work young, others only late. Some cycle through many hero journeys in rapid succession. Others transform slowly over decades. The pattern describes tendency and possibility rather than iron law. But both Jung and Campbell would agree that attempting to live as though you have unlimited time, as though you will remain young forever, as though development and transformation are optional, this is a recipe for psychological and spiritual crisis. Consciousness requires accepting that you are mortal, that time is limited, that your life has shape and meaning partly because it is finite. As we approach the end of this long night of contemplation, let us gather the threads of this conversation between two great explorers of myth and psyche. Carl Gustav Jung descended into the depths, exploring the collective unconscious, identifying archetypes, developing methods for working with dreams and symbols, creating a psychology that honored the sacred while remaining empirical. Joseph Campbell surveyed the world's mythology, identified the monomyth, articulated the hero's journey, helped modern people recognize that ancient wisdom remained relevant to contemporary life. Jung approached from psychology and moved toward mythology. Campbell approached from mythology and moved toward psychology. They met in the middle ground, where psyche and story intermingle, where inner structure and cultural narrative reveal themselves as two aspects of the same mystery. Their convergences were significant. Both insisted that myth is neither primitive error nor mere entertainment, but profound wisdom about human existence. Both recognized recurring patterns across cultures that point to something universal in human experience. Both saw transformation as central to human life and saw mythology as encoding knowledge about transformation. Both believed modern Western culture had lost touch with essential dimensions of meaning and needed to reconnect with symbolic and mythic depths. Both offered frameworks for doing so while remaining intellectually honest and psychologically sophisticated. Their divergences were equally important. Jung emphasized the autonomous reality of the unconscious, the numinous power of archetypes, the need for careful inner work through dreams and active imagination. Campbell emphasized narrative structure, cultural transmission, the hero's journey as pattern and guide for living. Jung worked with individuals in clinical settings. Campbell taught students and general audiences. Jung's orientation was introverted, Campbell's more extroverted. Jung saw myth arising from psyche. Campbell saw myth as cultural creation expressing universal experiences. These divergences are not failures of agreement, but complementary perspectives on a reality too complex for any single viewpoint to encompass. The psyche is both individual and collective, both structured by inherited patterns and shaped by cultural stories, both inward depths and outward expression. Myth is both psychological reality and narrative art, both spontaneous unconscious production and conscious cultural creation, both ancient wisdom and contemporary guide. Together, Jung and Campbell provide richer understanding than either alone. Jung, without Campbell, might become too focused on interior work, too removed from life's actual challenges and stories. Campbell, without Jung, might become too narrative, too focused on patterns without sufficient attention to the numinous reality underlying them. Read together, they balance and complete each other. Their dialogue also reveals something essential about how we might approach the great questions of human existence, meaning transformation, suffering, death, the sacred. We need both depth and breadth, both careful attention to what arises from within and wide survey of humanity's collective wisdom, both personal inner work and participation in shared stories, both psychological sophistication and narrative power. In practical terms, someone seeking psychological and spiritual development might benefit from both approaches. Work with your dreams, as Jung advocated. Attend to what arises from your unconscious. Learn to recognize archetypal patterns in your own psyche. Develop active imagination practices. Sit with symbols until they reveal their meanings. Also identify what stage of the hero's journey you inhabit, as Campbell suggested. Recognize the pattern. Find courage in knowing others have traveled this path. Make bold choices guided by what genuinely excites you. Share your gifts with community. The path is both inward and outward, both descent and journey, both contained in the consulting room and extending across the world's mythological traditions. You need both the map and the depths beneath the map, both the story and the numinous reality the story expresses. As Jung himself wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." And, as Campbell taught, the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. These two statements express the same essential truth from different angles, that human life requires meaning to be livable, and that meaning is found by becoming conscious, accepting transformation, connecting personal existence to eternal patterns, living your own unique myth while recognizing its participation in humanity's universal story. In this quiet hour before dawn, as you drift between waking and sleep, let these ideas settle not as intellectual content, but as invitations to your own deeper engagement with psyche and myth. Your dreams tonight may carry messages from the unconscious depths Jung explored. Your life tomorrow may present the next stage of the hero's journey Campbell mapped. Both are real. Both are yours to discover and live. The dialogue between Jung and Campbell continues, not merely in books and lectures, but in every person who takes seriously the twin calls to inner depth and to outer adventure, to individuation and to heroic engagement with life. You are that dialogue. Your psyche contains both the archetypal structures Jung described and the narrative patterns Campbell identified. Your life is both the material for analysis and the story being told. And so, wanderer in the night, as this long contemplation concludes, you are invited into your own journey between these two perspectives. Perhaps you will be drawn more to Jung's approach, finding that careful attention to dreams and symbols opens the depths you need. Perhaps Campbell's hero's journey will speak more clearly, providing the map and courage for your adventures. Most likely, you will need both at different times. Depth and breadth, psychology and mythology, inner work and outer action. The conversation between these two great minds illuminates a perennial truth that being human means living between world and psyche, between culture and individual, between the stories we inherit and the unique life we must discover for ourselves. We are neither purely autonomous individuals creating meaning from nothing nor simply products of collective patterns. We are both, mysteriously, and our task is to honor both dimensions. Jung teaches us to turn inward, to pay attention to what rises from the unconscious, to trust that the psyche has its own wisdom, that consciousness must learn to receive. Campbell teaches us to recognize the patterns, to see our struggles as stages in eternal journeys, to find courage in myth's assurance that transformation is possible. Together they teach that the inner and outer are one, that working with your dreams and living your heroic journey are not separate activities, but two aspects of the same sacred task. As sleep now draws closer, let go of trying to hold these ideas or resolve their tensions. Let them work in the depths beyond conscious control. Your unconscious has heard what it needs to hear. Your journey continues whether you are aware of all its stages or not. The archetypes are working within you already. The mythic pattern unfolds through your life even when you are not thinking about it. Trust the process Jung mapped and the journey Campbell described. Trust that your life has meaning even when you cannot see it clearly. Trust that transformation is possible even in the midst of difficulty. Trust that you are part of something larger than yourself while also being uniquely yourself. Trust that the dialogue between depth and story, between psyche and myth, between Jung and Campbell, is ultimately a dialogue between different aspects of the one mystery you yourself embody. Sleep now and dream. The collective unconscious awaits your encounter. The hero's journey continues through territories you will explore tomorrow. For tonight, rest in the knowledge that two great seekers have illuminated the path from different directions, and their combined light is enough to guide you forward, inward, deeper into the mystery of being human.